The cold came early that year, dropping out of the north in October like a blade through cloth. The valley sat remote and narrow, hemmed in by ridges thick with pine, the kind of country where winters settled in and stayed until it was good and ready to leave. Wind came screaming down the draw, stripping leaves from the aspens before they'd finished turning, piling snow against the north walls of cabins in drifts that wouldn't melt until April. The cabin owner stood in his doorway watching the weather build. A man lean from work and quiet by nature, known in town only as someone who kept to himself and didn't waste words. He had little money and fewer friends, but he had a plan that didn't require either. Inside the cabin, he'd begun laying stone, not outside for a chimney or a foundation repair, but inside, directly beside the hearth, sinking a line of heavy river rock into the earth beneath the floorboards. He worked slowly, fitting each stone against the next, packing clay between them, building a structure that looked like a bench but functioned as something else entirely. His neighbors rode past and saw him hauling rocks on a sled when he should have been splitting wood. They saw his modest woodpile and shook their heads. Winter was coming hard and early, and this fool was playing with stones. The cabin itself didn't inspire confidence. The walls were thin, single-layer logs with chinking that had seen better days. The stove was a small cast-iron box, second-hand and dented, the kind you bought when you couldn't afford better. His woodpile stood maybe 3 cords high, a third of what most families put up for a normal winter, and this winter was shaping up to be anything but normal. Neighbors looked at that cabin and saw a man who'd miscalculated, who'd freeze come January or February, who'd be begging for wood or dead in his bed when the real cold arrived. They didn't see the stone bench charging beneath the floor, or understand that he wasn't planning to fight winter with fire alone. He tested the system in early November before the serious cold hit, built a small fire in the stove and let it burn for 3 hours, feeding it steadily but not aggressively. The heat radiated from the stove and soaked into the stone bench, warming the mass slowly from the surface inward. When the fire died to coals and then to ash, he sat on the bench and felt the warmth still rising from the stone. An hour later, it was still warm. 3 hours later, it was still warm. 6 hours later, you could still feel it if you put your hand flat against the surface. This wasn't proof yet, just a hint, a suggestion that the physics might work the way he'd calculated. Then the first real storm rolled in, dropping 8 inches of snow overnight and pushing the temperature down to 0. And the neighbors laughed harder than ever. At the general store, where men gathered around a potbelly stove and argued about everything from cattle prices to the best way to split frozen wood, the stone bench became the topic of the week. Morrison, who ran a sawmill and considered himself an expert on heat and fire, said stone stole warmth instead of holding it, that everyone knew rock stayed cold no matter how close you put it to a flame. Peterson, a rancher with 40 years in the valley, said the builder was wasting effort on fool's work when he should be cutting wood like a sane man. Hendricks, who'd built most of the barns in the county, said he'd seen a lot of bad ideas, but burying stone beside a stove might be the worst. They all agreed the man would freeze, and they all felt a kind of satisfaction in that certainty, the way people do when someone else's failure confirms their own choices. The visitors came in groups of 2 or 3, riding up to the cabin under the pretense of checking on him, but really just wanting to see the madness up close. They stood in the doorway and stared at the stone bench, half buried in the floor, running 8 feet along the wall beside the hearth. It looked like a tomb, they said, a grave beside the fire. They asked him what he thought he was doing, building a rock seat when he should be banking coals and feeding flames every hour like everyone else. His wife stood in the corner, silent but worried, looking at the thin walls and the small stove and the stone bench that had consumed weeks of labor, and she didn't say anything, but her face said enough. He kept working, packing clay into the joints, smoothing the surface, saying nothing in return. When they asked why he didn't just buy a bigger stove, a real iron beast that could heat the whole cabin, he told them straight, he didn't have the money. A big stove cost what he made in half a year, and iron that size ate wood faster than he could cut it. Stone was free if you knew where to look and had the back to haul it. He'd chosen stone because stone didn't cost anything but time, and time he had. They looked at him like he was speaking another language. To them, heat was something you bought, either in iron or in wood, and if you couldn't afford enough of either, you suffered. The idea that you could build heat, store it, manage it like a resource instead of a consumable, didn't fit their understanding of how winter worked. The neighbors took pride in their methods. They showed off their woodpiles the way other men showed off livestock, pointing to cords stacked 10 feet high, talking about how many loads they'd hauled, how many trees they'd felled. They bragged about their stoves, how hot they burned, how the iron glowed red on the coldest nights, how you could cook on them in heat bath water and keep a cabin at 70 degrees if you fed them right. Heat was something you conquered every day, every hour, a constant battle that required strength and endurance and an endless supply of fuel. The idea of letting a fire die, of trusting stored warmth instead of active flame, struck them as weakness or insanity. Then the first hard freeze hit, dropping the temperature to -15 overnight, and the tension in the valley tightened like a rope under load. The stone bench worked because stone remembered heat. Thermal mass was the principle, though the builder didn't use that phrase when neighbors asked. He said it simpler. Stone takes in heat slow and gives it back slow. A stove heats air fast, and air moves and escapes and has to be reheated constantly. You're fighting the same battle every hour, pouring heat into space that won't hold it. Stone heated once stays warm for hours, sometimes half a day, radiating that warmth into the room long after the fire dies. The trick was getting enough heat into the stone and keeping it there, which meant building the bench thick enough to hold real mass, burying it to insulate against drafts, and positioning it close enough to the stove to absorb radiant energy without being so close that direct flame could crack it. He'd built the bench in deliberate layers, starting with a gravel base that let any ground moisture drain away instead of freezing and heaving the stone. On top of that, he laid river rock, pieces chosen for their density and size, each one flat enough to stack stable. Between the courses, he packed clay mixed with sand, working it into every gap until the structure was nearly monolithic. The bench sat 2 feet wide and 8 feet long, buried 10 inches into the floor with another 10 inches rising above it. The top surface was smooth, worn river stone sealed with a final layer of fired clay. The whole mass weighed close to 1,200 pounds, a battery made of stone and earth, waiting to be charged. Heat moved through the system in 3 stages. First, the stove radiated energy in all directions, infrared waves that warmed whatever they touched. The stone bench, positioned along the wall nearest the stove, absorbed that radiation to its exposed surface. Second, hot air from the fire rose and circulated around the bench, transferring heat through convection, warming the stone from the outside in. Third, once the stone was warm, it conducted that heat through its own mass, distributing the energy evenly from surface to core. When the fire died, the stone reversed the process, radiating stored heat back into the cabin, warming the air through convection and warming objects and people through infrared radiation, the same way the stove had, but slower, gentler, lasting hours instead of minutes. A stove spiked temperature fast and dropped it fast. You could feel the difference within minutes of opening the firebox door. A stone bench absorbed heat slowly, over hours, and released it just as slowly. The surface might reach 120 degrees during a charging fire, then cool to 90 over the next 4 hours, to 70 over the next 4, to 60 over the next 4. The cooling curve was gradual, predictable, manageable. A cabin heated by stove alone swung wildly between hot and cold, depending on how recently you'd fed the fire. A cabin heated by stored mass held steady, the temperature dropping gently through the night instead of plummeting the moment the flames died. He controlled the system through draft management and burn timing. Instead of running the stove wide open and feeding it constantly, he built smaller fires with the draft partially closed, forcing the wood to burn slower and hotter. More of the heat went into radiation instead of being carried up the chimney by rushing air. He timed his burns for maximum storage, firing the stove hard for 3 hours in the afternoon and again in the evening, charging the stone to capacity, then letting it coast through the night on stored energy. Neighbors ran their stoves all day and all night, chasing heat that escaped as fast as they made it. He made heat twice a day and banked it in stone. Skeptics worried about cracking, about moisture, about the stone stealing heat instead of giving it back. He addressed each concern with the kind of patience that came from having thought through every objection himself. Stone cracked when you heated it too fast or cooled it too fast, which was why he never let flame touch the bench directly. and why he buried the mast to prevent cold drafts from hitting warm stone. Moisture was handled by the gravel base and by choosing dense river rock that didn't absorb water easily. Soot and ash didn't reach the bench because the bench wasn't in the firebox or the flue path, just near them. Once a year, he inspected the clay seal and repaired any cracks, checked the gravel layer for settling, and swept the bench surface clean. The system was simple, robust, and required less maintenance than the average stove. Then the real cold came, and simple theory became life or death. The Arctic front arrived on a Wednesday night in early December, temperature dropping 40 degrees in 6 hours. By Thursday morning, it was -25. By Thursday afternoon, it was -35. By Friday morning, it was -42, and the wind was blowing so hard you couldn't see across the valley. The sky turned the color of old iron. Snow stopped falling because it was too cold to snow, the air too dry to hold moisture. Livestock froze standing in their pens. Sap in the pine trees froze and split the trunks with sounds like gunshots. Inside the cabins, frost formed on the interior walls. Nails wept ice. Water buckets froze solid within an hour of being filled. Neighbors went into full crisis mode. Fires roared day and night. Stoves fed every hour, sometimes every 40 minutes when the cold pushed back harder than the heat could push forward. Men took shifts through the night, one sleeping while the other fed the fire, then switching at 2-hour intervals because you couldn't trust a fire to last longer than that. Wood piles shrank at terrifying speed. Families watched their winter reserves disappear in days, doing math in their heads, calculating whether they'd make it to spring or run out in February and have to start burning furniture. Chimneys iced over from condensation freezing in the flue. Smoke backed into cabins, forcing people to choose between suffocation and cold. Exhaustion became its own kind of danger. Men too tired to think straight, too tired to judge the fire correctly, making mistakes that could kill you. The bench builder approached it differently. He fired the stove hard at 2 in the afternoon, feeding it split pine and oak, running it hot enough that the stove iron ticked and pinged from the heat. The stone bench absorbed that energy, the surface warming slowly, the mass storing heat all the way to its core. At 5, he fired it again, another 3-hour burn, charging the stone to maximum capacity. By 8, the bench surface read 118 degrees. At 9, he let the fire die to coals. At 10, he banked the coals with ash and closed the draft completely. The cabin held at 62 degrees. His family ate dinner in shirt sleeves, slept under 2 blankets instead of 6, and didn't wake until morning. In Morrison's cabin, 2 miles away, the temperature near the stove held at 50 degrees. 10 feet from the stove, it dropped to 40. Near the walls, it dropped to 32. Frost formed on the logs. Morrison woke every 90 minutes to feed the fire, stumbling through the dark, shaking with cold despite the flames. He burned through 80 pounds of wood between midnight and dawn and still couldn't push the cold back past the walls. His wife and children huddled near the stove in layers of wool and fur. Too cold to sleep, too exhausted to do anything but wait for morning. Peterson's stove cracked from thermal stress. A hairline split in the firebox that leaked smoke into the cabin. He had to choose between breathing poison or freezing, and he chose freezing, damping the fire until it barely glowed, wrapping his family in every blanket they owned, praying for dawn. Hendricks burned through 400 pounds of wood in 2 days, more than he'd planned for a week, and watched his reserves shrink while the cold showed no signs of breaking. At the bench cabin, the stone radiated steady warmth through the night. Not dramatic heat, not the blast of a roaring fire, but consistent gentle warmth that kept the interior temperature stable. By midnight, the cabin had cooled to 58 degrees. By 3 in the morning, it was 54. By dawn, it was 51, still well above freezing, still livable, still safe. The bench surface had cooled to 76 degrees, warm to the touch, but not burning. The builder woke rested, dressed in the dim light before dawn, and rebuilt the fire for the day's first charge. Then the tragedy hit, and survival stopped being theoretical. A homesteader named Carlson, living alone 3 miles up the valley, collapsed while hauling wood from his shed to his cabin. Hypothermia and exhaustion, the doctor said later, though by the time anyone found him it was too late. He'd made it within 20 feet of his door, arms full of split logs, and the cold had taken him before he could get inside. His stove had gone cold hours earlier. His cabin temperature had dropped below zero. He died trying to feed a fire that had already killed him by going out. At the Peterson place, they lost 6 head of cattle, animals that had survived 10 previous winters but couldn't survive this one. The barn wasn't insulated, and the cold pushed through the walls like water through a sieve. Peterson found them frozen in their stalls, eyes open, breath crystallized on their muzzles. The financial loss was devastating. The emotional toll was worse. Word of Carlson's death spread fast, and it changed the tone in the valley. This wasn't about pride anymore, or about proving who had the better method. People were dying, livestock were dying, the cold was winning, and fire wasn't enough to stop it. Morrison rode to the bench cabin on Saturday morning, ostensibly to check if the builder needed anything, but really to see if the rumors were true, if someone really was surviving the cold without burning through their entire winter supply in a week. He'd kept records since the cold snap started, writing down numbers in a ledger he'd bought for the purpose. Outside temperature at peak cold, -42 degrees. Interior temperature in main living area, 63 degrees near bench, 58 degrees at far wall. Bench surface temperature immediately after charging fire, 18 degrees. Bench surface temperature 8 hours later, 76 degrees. Bench surface temperature 12 hours later, 62 degrees. The cooling curve was gentle, predictable, exactly what thermal mass theory predicted. The stone gave back what it had absorbed, slowly and evenly, without spikes or crashes. Fuel consumption told the real story. From Thursday morning through Saturday morning, 48 hours of -40 cold, he burned 180 pounds of wood. Morrison, in the same period, had burned 900 pounds. Peterson had burned 1,000. Hendricks, who ran his stove at maximum the entire time, had burned 1,200. Extrapolate those numbers over a winter, and the difference became staggering. The builder would use perhaps 4 cords total. Morrison would use 18 to 20. Peterson would use 25. That was the difference between $40 and $200 if you could buy wood, or the difference between a few weeks of cutting and an entire autumn of brutal labor if you cut your own. Labor hours saved translated to energy saved, which translated to survival margin. Every hour a man didn't spend hauling and splitting wood was an hour he could spend hunting, repairing equipment, or simply resting. Exhaustion killed as surely as cold did. Carlson had died from exhaustion as much as hypothermia. The bench system didn't just save wood, it saved the man burning it. Morrison walked into the cabin without knocking, which was acceptable in that country during crisis. He stood just inside the door, still wearing his heavy coat, and looked around slowly. The stove sat cold and dark. The walls showed no frost. The air was still, quiet, warm enough that Morrison's breath didn't fog. He walked to the stone bench and stopped, put his hand on the surface and held it there. The warmth radiated into his palm, steady and even, the kind of warmth that didn't burn but didn't fade. He moved his hand along the length of the bench, checking for variation, finding almost none. 8 feet of thermal mass, all of it holding heat, all of it radiating into the cabin. Morrison looked at the ash pile in the stove. Small, a fraction of what should be there if a fire had been burning all night. He looked at the woodpile in the corner. Barely touched. He looked at the builder and said, "How long since you fed it?" The builder said, 9 hours. Morrison put his hand back on the bench. Still warm. He stood there for a long moment, pride and certainty collapsing into something harder to name. Finally he said, "I was wrong about the stone." The builder nodded. Morrison said, "Show me how you built it." They sat at the table and the builder sketched the design on paper, explaining the gravel base, the stone selection, the clay mortar, the thickness and burial depth. He explained the charging schedule, the draft control, the cooling curve. Morrison asked questions, real questions, the kind that came from genuine need to understand rather than need to prove something wrong. How deep did the gravel go? 8 inches. What kind of stone worked best? Dense river rock, nothing porous. How thick was the bench? 20 inches total, 10 buried, 10 exposed. How long did it take to charge? 3 to 4 hours with a hot fire. How long did it hold heat? 12 to 14 hours before it dropped below useful temperature. Peterson showed up an hour later. Then Hendricks. Then others. Word had spread that Morrison was at the bench cabin, and if Morrison was there, asking questions instead of mocking, something had shifted. They crowded into the small space, 8 men in heavy coats, and the builder explained the system again. Showed them the bench construction, explained thermal mass, drew diagrams of heat transfer, answered every question with the patience of someone who'd been waiting for this moment since he started digging. The skeptics became students. Winter had forced the lesson, and survival rewarded humility faster than any argument ever could. Spring came late that year, snow holding through April, but when it finally broke and the valley thawed, the sound of construction echoed across the hills. Stone benches were going in at Morrison's place, at Peterson's, at 4 other cabins scattered through the valley. The builder walked from site to site, checking depth, advising on stone selection, teaching the clay mix ratio. Some got it right the first time. Others had to tear out sections and rebuild. But by the following October, half the valley was sleeping on stored heat. Wood cutting dropped by 40%. Smoke inhalation cases at the doctor's office dropped to almost nothing. Families slept through the night for the first time in generations. The valley's entire relationship with winter shifted from constant battle to managed coexistence. Heat wasn't something you won by burning bigger fires. Heat was something you won by storing what you already made, by working with physics instead of against it, by building systems that remembered warmth when fire forgot. The bench in the builder's cabin still radiates heat 50 years later, the stone worn smooth by decades of use, the clay seal cracked and patched and cracked again, but holding. Mockery turned to method because numbers don't lie and neither do frozen men. Stone didn't steal warmth. Stone gave it back when fire died and night turned deadly, and the difference between stored heat and no heat was the difference between seeing morning and not seeing it at all.